Making cities work for people. Absolutely delighted to see so many people here. It's really exciting, and I think bodes well for a great day of combination of discussion, presentations, panel discussions. We're having a lot of different connections with people around the world through the day, which is the reason for the slightly late start. Apologies for that. And also welcome to the online audience. I think we have something around 100 extra people who we can't see who are following this event online or will be at different points in the day. So welcome to all of you. I think that for us, this is exciting for us at ODI, as it's bringing together a whole range of different strands of work on urban issues. Unlike some other issues here at ODI, we don't have a programme of work that is called urbanisation. Instead, we come to issues of urban contexts and urban societies from a whole series of different perspectives through the Institute. Our climate programme, our humanitarian programme, our growth, poverty and inequality programme. So we're coming at this issue, as I imagine are all of you, from a whole range of different perspectives. But I think one of the exciting things that's been happening over the last few years is that cities and the issue of urbanisation, of how people experience cities, how people live in cities, and the contribution that urbanisation and urban life makes to broader processes of social change and economic development have really come to the forefront of international development thinking and practice. And we can see that, in fairly stark terms in the inclusion of a goal on cities and urban life in the new set of sustainable development goals. Clearly there was no goal on urbanisation in the Millennium Development Goals, but it's likely that there will be in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's just one kind of symbol, in a sense, of the way that how the international development researchers and practitioners think about cities has changed in the last 15 years. What's interesting, I think, about cities and on the sort of research and practice on cities is the way that they are the sort of repository of many of our deepest hopes and fears about development. That clearly for the millions of people who move to cities, and for all of the kind of excitement around smart cities and all the sort of glitzy things that people hope they can do in cities, and for the economic literature on productivity and clustering, there's a huge amount of optimism and hope about urban life and the way that urbanisation for individuals and for societies can improve people's lives, can improve economic, can contribute to economic development and social change. On the other hand, of course, there are some deep fears and anxieties about this. There is fears of social unrest. There are fears of the insecure and often horrendous living conditions that people endure in cities, fear of violence and unrest, fear of resilience and the impact of urban environments on fragile climates. Of course, both of these are true. The fascinating thing about thinking about cities is the complexity, is the fact that they are, in many ways, they are both an enormously positive thing for people's lives and for societies in general, and also an environment in which life can be difficult and horrible, and people can often suffer greatly. And I think what we're hoping to do today is to fairly represent, in a sense, both sides of that picture, to talk both about some of the good things that are being done in cities, some of the positive developments that we're seeing, but also not to shy away from some of the difficulties and complexities in the process of urbanisation, in the experience of urban living for too many people. So the day will be roughly divided into two. This morning we will be talking mainly, we're starting with the positive, as we like to do here at ODI. We will be talking mainly about some of the success stories, some of the research that we've done recently on where things are improving in urban environments. And then this afternoon we'll turn to some of the issues around climate, around humanitarian practice, and some of the difficulties that people face in urban environments and the ways in which these are being tackled. Should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm sitting here awkwardly between two things, so it's difficult to know which of these people I am. But My name is Claire Malamed, and I'm the director of the Poverty and Inequality Programme here at ODI. I'm sitting here alone on the stage at the moment, but I'll shortly be joined by some of my colleagues to present some of our research. But before that, we wanted to show, we have a keynote presentation, unfortunately not in person, but on video, from Arima Revi, who I'm sure is very well known to many of you, the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, who unfortunately was not able to get here himself, but very much wanted to be a part of the day, so has generously recorded a video for us, which we're going to show in a moment. Let me also say a couple of housekeeping things. The event is obviously it's being live streamed, so it's very much on the record. For those of you who would like to tweet, the hashtag is Urban Futures. Please do so. We do find that a lot of people, you know, in a sense, we have people watching on the live stream. We also have people who are engaging sort of one further step removed by following the event on Twitter through the hashtag. So very much encourage you to do that. We won't judge people who are seen to be tapping away at your phones. We will assume that you are tweeting words of wisdom rather than texting your friends. So please do. And right, let me now turn to this is the test of the feverish technical activity that was going on here earlier, whether we can now show this video.
Good morning, I'm Arima Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. I'm very glad to be with you today. Unfortunately, I can't be with you in person because I'm flying back to India at the current point of time. So this is going to come to you via video. We're going to talk today about making cities work for people. Very often the focus of a lot of planning and economic development processes is how to make people work hard to make cities work. I think it'll be useful to try and inverse that connection and also look at how, because people are so central to the development and transformation of cities, how we can put people at the center of the sort of ongoing global transformation that we expect over the next 20 or 30 years. So the first question I'd like to ask is urban transformation possible? Many of us live in parts of the world in which the city has changed in many ways, but the fabric in some senses has not changed dramatically for a long time. And it's often a matter of contest about whether transformation is possible, or at least transformation is possible at a relatively short over a relatively short period of time. And the most interesting example being China. Here's an image of Shanghai from the late 1980s when Deng Xiaoping was starting up his process, and look at Shanghai now in 2014. This is a very clear and obvious sort of example of a dramatic transformation. But I guess the question that we want to ask us today is, behind this physical transformation that you see, the transformation of the fabric of the landscape, of the city as an image itself, what is the role of people, and how central have people been in this? Has it led to an empowerment? Has it led to a set of changes in their role? And how much of this is led by processes that work bottom up rather than necessarily top down? One of the core questions we should ask ourselves is people-centric development, especially in cities, possible? And does that lead to transformative results on the economic development front, on the social development, or the human development front, and of course in the way that we relate to the environment? Cities, of course, have been very important, especially in the last century, in enabling tremendous global changes. If we look at the history of the world over the last 50 or 60 years since the Second World War, in 1950 the urban population was about 3/4 billion and the urban economy was about 3 trillion in size. By 2010, as you can see, not only had cities spread across much of the globe, these are cities of 3/4 million and above from the UN Pop Division data. The urban population had risen to about 2.9 billion from 3/4 billion. But most important, the urban economy had grown from about 3 trillion to about 30 trillion. So a tenfold increase in the urban economy over that period of about 60 years or so. And if we look forward to the end of the period of the SDGs going out to 2030, we expect to see a population of about 5 billion people, a lot of them really in Asia, the beginning of an expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, Latin America, North America and Europe have been historically for the last 100 years or odd been largely urban. But the urban economy potentially growing to a size of about 90 trillion by that time. So a tremendous growth, slower than what we've seen over the last 50 or 60 years, but still an immense size of the urban economy. And if you look at the geographies, this is work from the UN Pop Division. IID put it together, I think, last year. You see that the bulk of the large cities are in Asia. Asia is, in a sense, the brown. Africa is in the sort of blues. And you see European cities, Paris, Moscow, and London, all the way down in the overall sort of hierarchy in terms of city size. So Tokyo, Delhi, Shanghai and Bombay being the 4 largest cities in the world projected for 2025. So a significant change in the geography of cities. But there is also something that we often forget, and that is, along with the increase in productivity and innovation, you also concentrate risk and you also increase the potential for conflict. So there is a dark side to cities, so to speak. The most obvious sort of image of this is when you have large numbers of people who actually come together. That's a classic image from Tahrir Square in Cairo, and this great opportunity to actually transform and effect a new political settlement. Of course, similar things happen on an everyday basis across the world. So the key question for us is, will this, at least at global scale, be inclusive and sustainable? The challenge, of course, of the 21st century is that over a less than 100-year period, especially given climate change and a whole range of other global environmental challenges, whether we can actually balance out the requirements for consumption that we've seen growing rapidly in a consumer-driven society, especially in the West and in the OECD countries, the requirements for population growth, because we're going to go up to about 9 billion or plus from about 7 billion just now, and of course the most important concerns that we have in the global South, and that is the challenge of ending poverty at present levels of throughput. And of course, if you add up all of this, the ecosystem services, or what the world in some senses can actually provide, is in serious deficit. So we need about 5.5 worlds. We only have one. Having said that, the big challenge for cities, as I said earlier, is that they concentrate poverty, informality, risk, and the potential for strife. In many parts of the world, 80 to 95% of the urban economy is in the informal sector. That's an example from Jakarta. If we look at New Orleans, you see that cities concentrate risk from natural hazards. This is an image from Hurricane Katrina. They obviously concentrate vulnerability. This is from Caracas. From India, the greatest and the most terrible industrial disaster that we've had in the world, Bhopal. They concentrate industrial accident risk. They also concentrate technological risk. This is an image from Fukushima and Sendai after the tsunami and the serious nuclear accident that we saw there. And of course, as we move forward into a regime of climate change, cities across the world will be exposed to significant climate change risk. This is just temperature mapping, but of course there are questions of drought, there are questions of other forms of climate risk that we expect to see. And then finally, cities, because of the way they are, because historically many of them have been structured on a very inequitous basis, they concentrate civil strife and violence. That was Kiev and this is Hong Kong. So we have to be able to look at this opportunity and this challenge simultaneously and try and balance out the negative and the positive externalities if we're able to try and sort of pull together the transition to a more sustainable future. So in some senses, the question that we're asking is, what do we hope to achieve at the SDG Summit in September at the UN General Assembly when we try and look at the Sustainable Development Goals? The first and most important thing, and this is the sort of the core articulation of the Urban SDG, Goal 11 from the Open Working Group, which states make cities and human settlements. So it's not only just urban areas, it's also other areas in the urban bioregion, if you want to look at it that way, or in rural areas and other locations. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, productive, resilient, and sustainable. The word productive, unfortunately, has sort of got somewhat lost in this debate, but it's an important one because employment is a very important consideration. So it means providing education and healthcare for 5 billion urban citizens. That's never been done before. It's a tremendous and a remarkable challenge, but if we were able to achieve it, it will actually transform the world as we actually know it. Moving somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people from slums. We have about 1 billion people in slums and informal settlements at the moment. If we are not very successful, there will be more people coming to them. And we want to be able to move them into situations of more secure housing and, of course, adequate services. Very important, creating about 600 million new meaningful jobs, along with addressing informality and improving working conditions. And then if we look at this sort of the totality of the urban economy, it is to build resilience and address informality in something that could be about 90 trillion in size. So that is really central to the challenge of trying to build a resilient future for the world. So in concrete terms, how could cities and regions enable this transformation? The first thing, of course, that we need to create slightly above 1 billion new productive jobs by 2030. This is going to be a remarkable challenge across the world, but this is the reason why cities are absolutely central to this agenda, because without urbanization and increase in city productivity, the opportunity of creating these jobs in some senses will not exist. And then, like I said earlier, we need to provide safe, adequate and well-serviced housing for somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people living in slums and informal settlements. This is an image from Hong Kong. To improve the situation of the built environment, securing it, making it more inclusive, and enabling access to green public spaces. Some of you will actually recognize this image from London. Enabling sustainable water supply and universal access to urban environmental services, a remarkable upgrading project from Bangkok, which is an example for people from pretty much across the world. Enabling secure regional food systems and sustainable agriculture. And this is an example from Vancouver. Cities themselves, at least in their earlier imagination, were not self-sufficient as far as food is concerned. In fact, they were tremendously dependent on what were hitherto called the hinterlands. That framing is changing, especially if you look at biophilic cities across the world. Sustainable and accessible transportation, a classic example from Bogota, but you find this across the world, including in the UK at the moment. London is a leader in trying to make interesting changes in this space. Green and clean manufacturing, reliable and sustainable energy systems. This is an example from Copenhagen. And of course, the deployment of disruptive technologies, including information and communication technologies, which permeate and help the citizen, the state, and a whole range of other formal sector actors actually work together and change the relationship, especially of power between them. So cities provide us this opportunity. And of course, there are many ways of doing it. One way is, of course, the Singapore sort of frame, an island state which was able to transform itself from being endemically poor, full of informal settlements, to become one of the sort of leading urban nations of the world. Porto Alegre or other cities in Brazil. Brazil has actually charted a very interesting path in its through the Statute of Cities and its own initiatives to not only mobilize its citizens, but also give them the framework to be able to act effectively, whether it's in terms of actually enabling better governance or participatory processes in terms of how resources actually manage themselves, or actually in some cases coming out onto the streets and saying that we need more things than just significant investments that come with, let's say, the Olympics or large mega events like the World Cup. And then, of course, China, the remarkable example, which is over the last 2.5 decades moved hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, primarily driven by the kind of urbanization that they've driven. So given the fact that cities and their citizens in many parts of the world can actually do a whole range of things, the question, I guess, before us in an instrumental way, both as researchers and activists and people involved in the urban debate, is what do we need to do over the next year and a half or so in the run-up through a whole range of major events this year, and of course in the run-up to Habitat 3, where hopefully this entire urban agenda will become not only mainstream, central to the global development frame, but also in some senses building a compact, building a relationship between a whole range of urban groups across the world, within countries and certainly within urban centers. There are 7 key steps in my mind that would help us move forward. The first one, and this is a very contested territory, is for especially the member states and including the private sector, and to some senses even civil society, to recognize that cities and regions are the key success factor for the successful implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's not only the goal around cities, but it's also, like I've shown you just now, education, healthcare, water, energy systems, even dealing with climate. And of course, centrally, especially when we're talking about citizens, it's also about the right to safety, it's about gender equality, and of course, behind all of this, the most important question, addressing urban poverty and through urban poverty, dealing with rural poverty and ending extreme poverty, let's say, in the next 2 decades or so. So the second thing, of course, is to place citizens, communities, and movements at the heart of the urban transformational agenda. This is something that is still in debate and contest. In some parts of the world, this has sort of moved forward, Latin America being a very interesting example. The movements that you see in some parts of North America and, of course, centrally in Europe move in this direction. You see some movements emerging, especially of poor people and the informal sector in other parts of the world. But by and large, the centrality of citizens and communities to making this transformative agenda possible is something that is not formally recognized in many parts of the world. So I imagine that we will see some changes in this space, certainly as the SDG plays itself out. The third thing, of course, is for member states of the UN to recognize that the urban SDG is not a threat, but actually a powerful opportunity to strengthen their economy, society, and polity. And of course, sitting behind this, as democracy deepens in many parts of the world, it's a question of how people actually engage with and participate in the governance, in the politics, in the social transformation that we expect to see in many parts of the world. Now, all of this will require resources, and these resources have to be available both top-down, as they largely are in most parts of the world, but also in some senses middle-up, middle-down, and bottom-up. So we do need to look at building a new architecture for localizing financing for development. This is a matter which is going to be, I guess, intensely contested in Addis Ababa next month at the Addis F50 conference. And then we do need to recognize that local governments and communities are central to this process, because without them, in some senses, citizens and movements will not have the kind of voice that we expect them to do. So one of the things that I expect to happen, at least either as a mainstream event or part of the sidelines of the SDG Summit, is a recognition that this is absolutely central and important. And then we hope in the Paris COP to see, as we've seen in the Climate Summit, that cities become a very important part of the implementation agreement in terms of what we can do, in spite of the fact that there are some disagreements between member states of the UN on a whole range of somewhat contentious questions around climate change. And then finally, to bring all of this together, we do need to establish a global geospatial monitoring and evaluation architecture. And I think one of the things that you should be debating at ODI today is what this would look like, what are the role of researchers, what is the role of action research, what is the role of activists in this process, what are the role of a whole range of agencies that are important for us to bring this together, and especially in an environment where new technologies, crowdsourcing, along with big data and good, clear analytical techniques can help strengthen the role of citizens, of movements, of a whole range of other players who, in a sense, define the agenda but have very little voice and limited agency in this overall frame. So to my mind, and I've said this in many places, including at UN Habitat, as we were opening last month, it's a question of establishing new global and local partnerships, a partnership between about 200 odd countries, member states of the UN, and at least 2,000 odd local and regional governments. But the local and regional governments are as strong as the support and the engagement that they have with their citizens. And in some senses, as this plays itself out, this will be a new political settlement, which will of course be underpinned by new governance and fiscal arrangements, because without that, the implementation of this process, operationalization of this process will become rather difficult. For politicians and people in the public policy space, this of course is all about 600 million new local jobs and the universal provision of public goods and services. So something that is tractable, something that would clearly be not only in the public interest, but in the interests of particularly interest groups, especially people in politics. But it's also about a multi-trillion-dollar urban infrastructure and housing finance opportunity. That's the reason why, for example, the private sector is quite interested in this debate, the formal private sector. Of course, since much of the world, at least in the global south, is built by people themselves, auto construction being the most important way of housing and providing services, there's also another view of how this sort of large global economy can play itself out. But this question, this multi-trillion-dollar question, is also the same conversation as the reworking of the global financial architecture, because you have many parts of the globe, or at least some parts of it, that have large financial surpluses, especially in Asia, and they are looking for opportunities to invest. So the question is, how do we build the architecture so that we can move the resources and the savings from the places where they're currently in surplus to areas that actually require them to be able to finance the housing, the basic services, the infrastructure, the schools, the healthcare systems, etc. So that's, I think, a central question that needs to be addressed. And like we've said earlier, the viability of the 21st century state system does depend on urban security, peace and safety. And it's not only the role of the state in this, but also of citizens and movements to enable this to actually happen. And in that sense, the urban SDG and its focus on security, equity and inclusion will enable it to become, if it were implemented effectively in many parts of the world, a key driver of sustainable development. To make this possible, we need to build governance and institutional capacity at multiple levels, at local level, of course, because that's how you're able to make cities work for people, at regional and national level, because that's how the aggregation happens and a whole range of processes actually come together, and in an increasingly interconnected world where people have access to both ideas, resources, finances, technologies from other parts of the world. We need to do this, of course, at extremely rapid space, because the time that we have, in a sense, the window of opportunity is probably, one generation, 20 odd years, before the negative impacts of global environmental change and a whole range of other challenges that we expect to see start actually impinging on the space that we have to make this change. It won't happen on its own. We need to mobilize institutionally and politically. So we're talking about millions of people from across the world over the next 15 years, millions of citizens actually coming together and using a whole set of stepping stones, whether it's the G20 meetings or the FFT in Addis or the high-level political forum or the World Economic Summit or mayors in the SG Summit that we hope to hold, at least 2 of them later in the year, COP21, or finally in 2016 Habitat 3, where we'll see hopefully some of these streams coming together. So that institutional and political mobilization is very central, because without that, these are nice ideas. They will work in some places and they will deliver some impacts. But if we want to scale them to enable everybody everywhere to access them, and that's exactly what the SDGs are about. The SDGs are different from the MDGs in the fact that they are applicable to everybody everywhere, from LDCs and countries that are extremely poor on the per capita income scale to those which are much more well endowed. So it's really a global agenda, something that we haven't seen now, I would say, almost since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The challenge for us is, given the complexity, the multiple scales, the whole range of sectors, and the opportunity for cities to actually bring this together, whether we can get our act together institutionally, as sort of sets of movements, as actors from the research and academic space to help reflect on this process, and of course, most centrally, politically and institutionally. So it's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, I think that set us up beautifully for the day, and the sense of the kind of financial, the governance, the technical challenges involved in this rather ambitious aspiration that we have here, making cities work for people, and particularly the huge range of actors involved. So we're going to move now from this kind of big global picture down to the local to look at some specific examples of change that has happened. In lieu of being able to ask Dr. Revi any questions, while my colleagues are coming up to the panel, let me just encourage you to quickly talk to your neighbours about that and about what you've heard, any kind of questions, things you agree with, disagree with in Dr. Revi's video, and let me invite my colleagues to come up to the stage to start the next part of the day.